5. So good morning and welcome to the second session of the day in the climate policy strand of the high school climate change symposium. For the session, we have Deputy Director James Clift of the Michigan Department of Environment, and he's talking about moving forward to address climate change. His presentation will outline steps that Governor Whitmer plans on taking in addressing climate change. Deputy Director James Clift oversees policy and engagement work for the department and his role as Deputy Director and Environmental Justice Public Advocate. Prior to joining the department, James was the policy director at the Michigan Environmental Council for 20 years. So thank you for coming. And yes, so for this session, if you have any questions, we're gonna hold them till the end for him to answer. So.
No, you can do it anytime.
Oh.
You can interject at any time here.
Okay, sorry. So yeah, so anytime, just have a question, feel free to put it in the chat or in the Q&A part, and he'll just answer them throughout the session. So, floor is yours now.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. And again, I'll be focusing on, addressing climate change and the steps that Michigan is taking to kind of move forward in this area. Before I get into my formal presentation, it's kind of interesting you're watching this stuff happen in real time. The governor this morning issued an executive order declaring an energy emergency. And not because so much of what was happening in Michigan, but because of what's happening in the rest of the country. People have seen on the news what's happening down in Texas, and their need kind of to address, unusual kind of extreme cold weather. So the energy emergency the governor declared allowed kind of truckers in Michigan to truck heating fuel and propane to other states that are having challenges kind of dealing with the emergency. So it just suspends some of the rules regarding how many hours they can operate, just so that we can help our neighboring states address kind of the crisis that they're going through today. I'm gonna pull up my presentation here, and hopefully you can see this. Again, my name is James Clift. I'm the Deputy Director at the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. I oversee kind of what generally kind of the policy and engagement work at the department. So below on my team are the Office of Climate and Energy, the Office of the Clean Water Public Advocate, the Office of the Environmental Justice Public Advocate, our Communications Office, and our Legislative Affairs Office. So kind of engaging with outside groups in generally, but been working really closely with Dr. Brandy Brown. She is the chief coordinator in our Office of Climate and Energy, and has been overseeing much of the work that I'll be talking about here today. And my screen doesn't want to move forward on me, so I'm gonna reset this real quickly here. There we go. So again, I mentioned the Office of Climate and Energy. This is our kind of primary office to kind of coordinate our climate response activities. They'll be kind of advising state and local governments on how to address kind of climate change issues and kind of mitigate the issues that they're kind of seeing before them. We're hopefully going to be providing guidance on how we can reduce greenhouse gases kind of moving forward, advance renewable energy and energy efficiency. And we'll be kind of talking about many of these topics as I kind of go through my presentation today about kind of actions that the state has been taking. At this point, the governor has issued a couple of executive orders in this area. And the first one created the Climate Solutions Council. The key to an issue like climate change, and we'll get into this a little bit today, is this: what is the role of state government? What's the role of local government? And what's the role of businesses and families across the state? So what can the state do to kind of coordinate those efforts? Obviously, climate change is a huge issue. So it really is going to take a collective response by people at all levels to try to get our arms around this one and move forward. So the governor has appointed this Climate Solution Council, and it has 13 individuals from the private sector, some nonprofits who have been working in this area. And the idea is get this kind of broad group of people together so that they can help us put together what we're calling the Michigan Healthy Climate Plan. How do we all move together forward to address kind of climate change in general? So, what are those great opportunities that might present themselves? What are those particular challenges that Michigan is going to face that maybe other states aren't facing? And then making sure that when we take certain actions, you're always worried about kind of unintended consequences. Are there areas that might be disproportionately impacted by either climate change or the steps you're trying to take to address climate change? Sometimes, and I'll talk about a little bit, how some of the industries that are in the energy and energy production field have been changing pretty significantly. Well, sometimes that means that someone who was working in one of those industries in one area, you got to maybe retrain them so that they can work in another area. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But the idea about the Michigan Healthy Climate Plan, Executive Directive 2020-10, is the idea that Michigan should be carbon neutral by the year 2050. Doesn't mean that we'll stop using all carbon, but that we'll kind of make up with it and maybe trying to sequester carbon or do other actions to try to minimize the impact of any carbon kind of remaining kind of in our economy. The first step toward that goal is try to reduce kind of our emissions starting in the year 2005 and get a 28% reduction by 2025. We're on a path to do that. We think that's possible. And really start to look at this next step. What do we need to do by 2030? What do we need to do by 2040? Because we know that in state government and society in general, people need to see kind of what's that next step? What's that next goal we need to meet to make sure that we're kind of achieving kind of what we're trying to get to. And we'll talk about how, state facilities, we realize we've got a footprint ourselves. We have a number of state buildings. So how can we reduce our energy use within those state buildings? And hopefully the state itself, state government, becoming carbon neutral by 2040, 10 years before we expect the state as a whole. Again, trying to lead by example and show how these things can be done and kind of share the experiences that we have kind of at the state level. You look at kind of greenhouse gases today in the United States, and this pie chart really has started to change significantly. You see right now, transportation is the #1 emitter of carbon into our atmosphere at this point. For a long time, it was electricity production, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but now transportation is #1. Industrial uses, about 22%, so they're coming in kind of third there in line, followed by, commercial and residential, and then agriculture. So, really, if you think about trying to get to carbon neutrality, start trying to think about drastically reducing our carbon, it is going to take the collective effort of a lot of people to get there. You see the other chart where you see total US greenhouse gas emissions, we've started to put a dent in it, but this is where we really need to accelerate this curve. This is where we really need to kind of step forward in making sure that we're kind of achieving kind of greater gains kind of going into the future. So our approach is really looking at those three kind of biggest sectors and trying to figure out how they would need to change in Michigan. What steps do we need to take? So first we have electrical generation, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. How do we reduce our use of fossil fuels, coal and natural gas? How do we increase that renewable energy? And then identifying fugitive emission. This gets into the fact that, just getting fuel to power plants, there's kind of, you'll get methane that will leak from the pipes and things like that. How do we make sure that that it's tight as possible so we're not really wasting energy and it getting into the atmosphere prior to us even using it? Energy consumption. This is a biggie, and we'll talk about it more, about how do we reduce our use in general. And then transportation. Michigan, of course, people who've been here for a long time grew up in the automotive sector. So how is that automotive sector going to be changing over the next 20, 30 years? And what's that look like? And what's that mean for the residents of the state of Michigan? And we'll talk about that a little bit. But those are kind of the three primary areas that we expect that we're going to see kind of a lot of effort kind of going forward. So we start here, and if you look at, where we used to get our energy from, and not too long ago, you think about it, 2008, just 12 years ago, 70% of the electricity in Michigan was generated using coal-fired power plants. They are the most heavily carbon kind of emitting way to create electricity. So this was really kind of an area that we knew kind of had to be reduced. 24% nuclear power, only 4% natural gas, and just 2% kind of renewable energy at the time. So as you can see, not very long ago, we were extremely heavily dependent on coal to power kind of the electrical grid in Michigan. You look at that today, and that 70% is down to 32%. So, that really has been a great success story as far as taking those older coal-fired facilities offline. We still got, a half a dozen kind of larger plants in Michigan and a scattering of smaller ones in Michigan. And each of those are looking carefully at the retirement dates for each of those plants to figure out, when can the rest of that coal-fired power come offline, just because we know that is the most carbon intensive. And now it's taking those offline will help immediately. The biggest gain you see is kind of that yellow swath, that the natural gas plants. They, back in 2008, was really only about 4% of our energy. We used it to kind of power ourselves in those hot summer days. They call the peak energy times, when everybody would kind of turn on their air conditioner at the same time. So they would power up what they called natural gas peakers in order to serve power during that time. Well, because of changes in the way that we explore for natural gas, fracking, you have undoubtedly heard from, lowered the price of natural gas, made it much more abundant in the US. So what you see mainly is a switch from that coal-fired power to the natural gas power. Now that reduced carbon, but it didn't eliminate it. So really a lot of people talk about that natural gas as being kind of the transition fuel to the future. What is going to be that future in Michigan where we can grow that last light, that 8% renewable energy. That one is going to be going up significantly over the next 5 to 10 years. We're still kind of catching up. Again, we were at 2 or 3% back in 2008. We're up to 8% today. That should shoot up to about 15% in the next couple of years. Really, in the next 2 to 3 years, you'll see that number almost double again to 15%. And the utilities have announced in Michigan that they're hoping to achieve 30 to 35% by 2030. So you can see a significant increase in that green slice, and that's good for Michigan. Currently, that is mainly wind-powered energy. So especially if you've traveled up in the thumb of Michigan recently, A lot of wind turbines up there. If you head north on 127, some significant facilities along 127 in Alma to up through St. Louis, up to Mount Pleasant, a significant wind farm in that area. So that's about 70% of our renewable energy right now is coming off of wind power generation. And what we're seeing now is an explosion also of solar in Michigan. The price continues to come down. So we're starting to see larger and larger kind of solar developments come online, utility scale solar, they call it, so these are, might be 100 acres of solar panels collecting energy. Of course, people are also increasingly doing it on their own homes and businesses. So you see kind of more solar kind of implemented kind of at that more local level. So again, good sign. And I'll talk a little bit later. It's not going to be the whole solution, but it's a good slice of it in a really a positive area where we're seeing great strides being made. This is also an area, and I'll get into this a little bit more, where government and state government is very influential. Your electric generation industry is usually regulated at the state level. So the Michigan Public Service Commission in Michigan regulates electric utilities, especially most of them anyway, especially the large ones in Michigan, Consumer Energy and DTE. They serve about 85% of Michigan residents, and those are overseen by the Michigan Public Service Commission. They basically authorize kind of closing plants, building new ones, how much money should they be spending on energy waste reduction efforts, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. But again, this is an area where kind of state control of this industry is helping us kind of move the needle on this one as far as reducing the carbon impact from electrical generation.
We do have
energy,
from the
got a question?
We do. The question is, does the state work with utility companies to have more renewable energy made or used?
It does. So part of it is that the utilities are required to every 2 to 3 years, they file a renewable energy plan with the state, shows how much they're, basically generating from renewable energy, and then how much they want to invest in the next 5 years in renewable energy. It's also part of what they called an integrated resource plan, where a utility looks at basically all the money it's spending on power plants, renewable energy, energy waste reduction, efforts. And the Michigan Public Service Commission basically works with the utilities and then other intervening parties. So environmental groups and others will intervene in those cases. And then those plans end up dictating how the utilities are going to make investments, for the next 5 years. But they're looking out 10 years, they're looking out 15 years. So again, there's been a big effort in trying to get the utilities to increase that renewable energy. It does take a little time to build it. So it's not something where you flip a switch overnight. But again, we're going to see that 8% jump up to 15% pretty quickly, and then up to 30% in the next 9 years. So making good progress in that area. You'll see some other states that have percentages that might be greater than that, but Michigan is also a relatively industrial state still. So we use a lot of electricity. Therefore, when we do 30% of our electricity from renewable, that's, that dwarfs some of what you see out in maybe some smaller states, something like Iowa, that has a lot of wind energy. They just don't, as a percentage of their overall pie, it's just their pie isn't very big out there because they're mostly agricultural based economy versus kind of the industrial base that you see in Michigan. So the key on energy consumption is that renewable energy alone is not going to solve the problem of climate change. We got to reduce the amount of energy we use, hopefully providing all the goods and services we do today. We just need to figure out how to do it more efficiently. If you look at Michigan residents, they use most of their energy to heat and cool their homes. So if you think about, better insulation, in homes, making them more efficient in that regard. That's the number one way that Michigan residents can reduce their overall use of carbon, is actually through making their home more efficient, and better insulated. But Michigan has a lot of older building stock, so it's important that we get to a lot of that building stock and make improvements so that they use less energy kind of for heating and cooling. Programs currently run by our utilities are trying to reduce electricity by 2% a year. They're up above 1.5% a year. And natural gas, we're trying to reduce our demand for natural gas by about 1% a year. But the important part of that is just kind of continuing to do it year after year after year. It is a great investment by the state of Michigan and a great investment by the utilities. So in 2018, they invested about $350 million in kind of helping us reduce our energy use. That was projected to save Michigan residents $1.2 billion over the next 10 years on their utility bills. So for every $1 we spend today, we're saving almost $3.50 in the future. So a great investment, which is also, so it saves our businesses and residents money, makes that family budget a little easier to manage. But it also is working to reduce the impacts of climate change and try to minimize those long-term impacts. So we're hoping to ramp those up kind of as long, as high as we can, because you get 2%, after 10, 20 years, that starts to be a significant bite where you kind of shrunk that energy pie that you have to produce the energy to serve. One other kind of concept I want to introduce here is that we look at two ways we look at energy use. We look at peak demand and we look at overall use. This example in Texas for the past week has been a good example of where that peak demand. Texas, doesn't usually get sub-zero, doesn't usually get very cold down there, and it has been. So their electricity use shot up because a lot of people use electric heaters, to heat their homes. And so from looking forward, it wasn't more than they expected in a worst case scenario. But what happened there is their power grid couldn't handle it, and they couldn't produce enough electricity to serve that peak demand. So to the extent that you can better insulate a home, you kind of reduce that peak demand because it takes less energy, even in the most extreme temperatures. And we can circle back to Texas at the end if people have other questions of kind of what's happening there. But again, trying to reduce both those peaks, those summer peaks in Michigan, usually that's when we peak, when everybody turns on their air conditioners, but trying to reduce people's overall use too. As we mentioned before, emissions from mobile sources, exceed that from stationary sources. And this is really just in the last couple of years that the transportation sector has taken over as the #1 sector. So we see this as extremely important to Michigan because both it's been a big part of our industrial base, has been building vehicles, doing research and development on vehicles. So trying to figure out where, what the vehicles of the future look like, we think Michigan can play kind of a key role in trying to define that and help kind of with that transition. Because there is going to be a transition. I mentioned earlier, you've got General Motors announced recently that it wants to stop building internal combustion engines by 2035 and switch entirely over to electric vehicles or fuel cells. But that's a big change for an industry like the automotive industry over a relatively short period of time. So making sure that the workers that are at auto plants today are kind of retrained, and hopefully some of those auto plants of tomorrow to build batteries and those electric motors can also be located in Michigan and in the Great Lakes region, so that we continue to be kind of a hub for the automotive sector. So kind of looking down the road, well, what's it going to take to be ready for those cars of the future? So the first step kind of up in the corner here is we have an EV charger infrastructure study. So we're looking to see, hey, where, would we want to put chargers around the state so people don't feel like they're going to basically run out of power somewhere, not be able to get home. We know from current studies that most of the charging gets done at home. Most people, most of their driving happens, very close to their home. They're going to work, they're doing errands, they go back home, they recharge their vehicles. And that's how we expect most of it will continue in the future. But we also realize, hey, we like to vacation, we like to take longer trips. And therefore, where are those chargers? Where should they be located so that people who are on longer trips, kind of going down the highway, know that they're going to be able to pull in, maybe have a quick lunch. In the meantime, their vehicle's getting charged up so they're ready to go again. So again, we did some planning. We have got some studies now that show where should those chargers be around the state. We're now starting to fund putting those chargers in. So we've got a partnership with the utilities in this area where the utilities put up a third of the money, the state of Michigan puts up about a third of the money, and then a private, individual put up a third of the money. So maybe it's a fast food restaurant or something that thinks, hey, if I put in some electric chargers, people who come to my restaurant stop in here for lunch while their vehicles are charging, and in 20 minutes they can be ready to go. So working with different people in the private sector to try to make sure that we get those kind of placed where they need to be. So we're already kind of making grants in that area, kind of moving forward. We're also using what's called our Volkswagen settlement funds. People might remember that Volkswagen was caught kind of cheating on its emission testing. So they were required to kind of fund a big trust fund that each of the states in the country are being able to tap now in order to kind of fund some efforts in this area. So we've been tapping that money. We've been spending some of it for chargers. We've been spending some of it for replacing like school buses with electric school buses and looking at different places where maybe delivery vehicles could be switched from gasoline to electric. So looking to try to support that migration from one type of vehicle to the next, or making sure that we're getting a cleaner vehicle that has less carbon. And lastly, down in the other corner is our clean diesel program. So a lot of the older diesel engines out there in the market still, where can we kind of at least replace those with a cleaner diesel engine, or whenever possible, where can we convert that to electricity? Then one other really important area is, where can Michigan kind of lead, by example, as I mentioned, using these VW settlement monies to kind of make things happen where we'd like to see it happen. Reducing energy use in state-owned buildings. So we, like any other business, are looking to see, hey, where can we better insulate our buildings and reduce that energy use? And the state owns a fair amount of land. So is there some areas where renewable energy could be placed on that state land, either to serve a state facility or to serve the community in general, kind of where that is located? So we kind of keep looking for opportunities where, we want to make sure that if there's a learning curve and there's a greater cost to that learning curve, where can the state kind of be that one that learns, then teaches others how to do it more efficiently and potentially less expensively, kind of going forward. So that's the end of kind of my formal kind of remarks, but I do have kind of some informal ones where, unless we have any questions right now, I thought I would talk about Texas a little bit more and how the climate impact kind of overlays with kind of some of the environmental justice work, we're doing at the department.
So we have a question in the Q&A. It says, how does the state help to support workers in industries that are dying? For example, coal or auto plants. Do they provide them with access to job retraining, job placement services, etc.?
Yeah, so in the utility sector, it's worked pretty well because utilities are fairly large employers and they tend to try to plan things on a timeline. So they'll know 5 years in advance that they're going to close a specific plant. So they've been able to use retirements or transferring workers to other facilities that they have and kind of retraining their workers kind of within their organization. So Michigan, of course, doesn't mine for coal. We ship most of it in from the West Coast, but there is some national programs that are kind of addressing kind of worker retraining for people who have been working in the mines themselves. The auto sector is one that we're looking very carefully at because we realize that that is an area that could see some worker disruption. So we're looking at, potentially places that those workers could be retrained to work in either other facilities or ones that are related to kind of electric vehicles, be it the charging industries, batteries, things like that. But that's one we're looking very closely at. Michigan always does have kind of job training money that it's using. So once again, we're trying to predict, which jobs are those and might be the jobs in the future that they're well suited for. One that a lot of people don't think about is just auto mechanics in general. As you move from an internal combustion engine to an electric engine, electric motor, you have many fewer parts in the actual vehicle, moving parts. So there's a lot less work that needs to be done on the vehicles, which means that we'll need less auto mechanics in the future. Oh, well, if you think about that up front, okay, what are other areas where, working on electric motors in general, what is kind of what's the future of electric motors and servicing electric motors, making them more efficient? What are those jobs that we could be retraining folks for?
Okay, so we have a. Oh, go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, okay.
No.
So we have another question. It says, is Michigan working with other states to reduce emissions?
Yeah, so we have a number of programs that we work with mostly our Midwest partners. One of them is in kind of the electric charging, area, thinking that, well, if people are driving long distances, they're driving through multiple states. So we've been working with kind of, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, looking so that as someone maybe is driving across the country, is that charging network kind of designed to make sure they can go anywhere they want to go? So in that regard, we've been working with other kind of states in that regard. Up on the Upper Peninsula, on the Michigan-Wisconsin border, of course, this is an area where it's more rural, less population up there, but we realize we need chargers all the way across the UP so someone doesn't think they could get stranded there. We're also thinking about kind of tourism in Michigan and saying, would you line the lakes with a network of chargers so that people who are taking their summer vacation and just kind of wanted to drive around the Great Lakes, they would make sure that they had kind of access to their chargers. So again, trying to think of those different ways that people use their vehicles today and where we might be able to provide services for them in the future. A lot of the other work has to do with, if you look at especially the auto sector, it's very regional in nature. So Ohio might have plants, Indiana might have plants, Michigan have plants. They don't like to move their parts too far, but they will move them around the region. So we are kind of keeping tabs on kind of what's happening in those other states to make sure that we're trying to coordinate efforts. Michigan is still probably the hub for research and development when it comes to the automotive sector. So again, we're trying to make sure that once they finish that research and what those new vehicles of the future are going to look like, that they start building as many of them as possible here. You're seeing a lot of emphasis on the electric vehicles on the coast, California and the East Coast, because they've been trying to kind of push down their emissions longer. I think, we're going to start to see a lot more, especially in the next couple of years, with Ford and General Motors offering a lot more electric vehicles, and you'll see them everywhere. That's all questions from the moment.
No, we have another question in the chat. It says, how would you recommend people, but students specifically, go about reaching out to governments to voice their concerns about the climate to actually be listened to? There are so many efforts being made around the world, but it feels as though nothing is getting through.
It's a good question. And, just give you a couple of minutes of my career. Students usually kind of interested in that too, is where I went to high school in Birmingham. I was born in Flint. Ended up graduating from Birmingham High School outside Detroit. Went to Central Michigan University, then Wayne State Law School down in Detroit. But then right after school, I practiced law for a couple of years, but then I worked for the legislature for 10 years. So I got a really good view of, kind of what changes the legislators' minds, and that hasn't changed drastically over time. And it's kind of interesting because you see all these electronic kind of media these days and social media, but really the most effective way to get to a legislator is a lot of them still are, once we get past COVID, going to be a few, more months, hopefully by the end of the year, they'll have like local coffee hours, and it's amazing just showing up at those little local coffee hours and talking to them one-on-one, can have an impact. Writing a personal letter or email to a legislator can have an impact. They'll get a lot of form letters, but the more personal it is, the better. A phone call into their office. Again, if they look at the fact that if someone takes the time to do that personal touch, it means more to them. They also want to know how are you networked? So if you're part of a club that's working in this area, or part of your church, or part of a high school club or something, if you tell them, oh, I'm working with 20 other people in my community on this issue, they realize that's more of the people that, elected them into office might be kind of interested in kind of moving forward in this area. So again, personal touches, collective touches. Unfortunately, the form letters and the form emails are having, I think, a little less impact, and that's because of you get these overseas bots and stuff jumping on and creating a lot of noise in that universe. So the more personal, the better. But even state agencies, a lot of our programs will have opportunities for public comments, and we take those seriously. We are many times tied by whatever statute that we're kind of working under. A lot of times somebody will be asking for a permit. We have to kind of follow the rules of that permit. But, to the extent that people give substantive comments, we're always listening. No others at the moment? I'll talk about Texas for a few minutes. I think it's been kind of interesting to kind of watch on the news, kind of what happened there. And unfortunately, these days you get a lot of information and you get some misinformation. So as it's kind of starting to be a couple of days old, it's been interesting to kind of watch, what really happened during the whole thing. So the first part is that the last time they got a big winter storm was in 2011. And they had some of the same issues that they're having today. Not nearly as many people lost power, but, quite a few did. And at that time, they did reports and they said, hey, our industry has to do a better job at winterizing all of our facilities. Because of climate change, we know that it's going to get cold here more often. Therefore, we need to do a better job of making sure we're ready for winter. The bottom line is that they said it and they didn't do it. So that when it got really cold again this time, and again, their predicted amount of power demand was right about where they expected it, the natural gas, primarily natural gas plants, kind of froze up. They don't keep a lot of natural gas in storage like Michigan does. They just assume, hey, it's all around them. It's in these wells. The wells will deliver it to us when we need it. A lot of those wellheads froze, so people couldn't get natural gas to the plant. So that was the number one reason that their kind of grid crashed, was the failure of natural gas plants to deliver. Nuclear, wind, solar, each were diminished, but not to the extent that natural gas was. So it was mainly that inability to create power that kind of crashed their system. Again, investments in energy efficiency, weatherizing homes. For down there, you'd mainly be weatherizing to reduce your use for air conditioning in the summer, but it would also help you in the winter because you wouldn't need as much to heat your home. Texas is also a strange animal in that it has its own power grid. The rest of the country has what they call regional transmission organizations. We partner up with, I think now 13 other states that are part of our grid, and we're right next to somebody who has an equal number of states. And there's interconnections between those organizations that where if somebody doesn't have enough power, sometimes someone next to them can kind of bring power into them. Texas is off on a little bit of an island there, so they've got limited interconnection with other grids. So unfortunately, they thought they had themselves covered, and they didn't. So again, I think they're going to be looking at, can we partner better with our neighbors? Maybe having our own grid and trying to do everything ourselves wasn't the best idea. But then secondly, that investing in energy waste reduction, I think, could pay off big in Texas. Last thing I wanted to mention was kind of environmental justice. And as we look at climate change, we're trying to keep one eye on kind of environmental justice moving forward. And that kind of comes in a couple of different ways. We've set up what we call our climate brain trust. So, half a dozen people who are really looking at just the environmental justice impacts of everything we do in the climate arena, just to tell us, hey, you might want to think about this. You might want to, consider this other way. The environmental justice is kind of, making sure that those people that have been impacted by, historically from increased emissions, or kind of they may be located closer to industrial facilities. We saw kind of through COVID, they had a greater impact on the health impacts, but we're trying to make sure we keep an eye on them. So part of it, when we look at the EJ issue, is okay, emissions from power plants. As we've reduced those number of coal plants, we've reduced emissions of pollutants. And it's not only carbon we're worried about, coal plants and a number of other emissions that were impacting these communities. So this transition from coal to natural gas and renewables, and hopefully even more renewables, will reduce emissions and improve air quality in Michigan. That's especially important in some of those communities that have been hardest impacted. But you think about it, once you get past electrical generation, everything I've talked about today is about vehicles and about people's homes. Those are individual changes that have to be made on a very individual basis. And people of lower income are going to challenge with maybe having access to those cleaner choices. Can they afford an electric car? Can they afford to, retrofit their home to insulate it greater? So it's really an access to capital. Can they get their hands on the money that over the long term is going to save them money on energy efficiency? I said, you spend $1 today, you're going to save $3.50. So we're looking at innovative ways where can we lend those people the money that don't have it today, knowing that their utility bills are going to be less and they can pay us back over time. So the idea of basically maybe having a loan that really shows right up on your utility bill. So they lend you the money to do the energy efficiency work, your utility bill goes down, but if you add your new bill to the little payment on the loan, it's still less than your old bill, but you get two benefits out of it. Eventually you pay off that loan and you're just going to pay less for energy, and you're usually living in a healthier home in general. So looking at that issue of how might these climate policies impact kind of low income individuals kind of moving forward. The last challenge for those low income individuals is a lot of times they're renters, they're not homeowners. So the landlord is the one that would have to invest in making the home more efficient. The renter might be paying the utility bills. So they have kind of the split incentive there. So how do we get landlords to invest in their homes so that the renters don't have to pay as much for their utility bills? So that's been a tricky one. People have been working on it for a while, but we're looking at that one very closely because, if you're living in substandard housing that's not insulated well, A, you're kind of contributing to that climate change, and B, you're blowing through money you don't have and you don't want to be wasting on paying for energy costs.
So there's a question in the chat. It says, when planning for the future, how extensively do you incorporate demographic or other changes from climate mitigate or migration?
Yeah, so this is kind of a new area of, if you really, especially if you look at how we've always regulated electric utilities in the past, it's always been about economics. How much does it cost to build a new plant? How much does this fuel cost? How much will it deliver power when we need it? Unfortunately, in the past, we didn't look at the fact that, a coal plant has a lot of dirty emissions that are going to have health impacts. And those health costs are borne by people in the state of Michigan. But we didn't take those health impacts into consideration when we were making these decisions regarding which power plants to build. So we're trying to do a better job at looking at the health impacts of decisions that we're making and making sure that those aren't ignored moving forward. As we look at kind of the electric, vehicles, we're looking at kind of the same issue. Is right now the price point's pretty high. We're hoping to see that price point come down lower. And what we're also expecting to see is a lot more vehicle sharing, kind of the Uber, situation where eventually it might be an autonomous vehicle that, you pick up your phone, you order a vehicle, it shows up outside your door. You don't even own a vehicle anymore. Well, how is that going to impact? Does that make it a little easier for someone who can't afford to buy a vehicle? But hey, if they could use Uber or an autonomous vehicle to get to work, maybe that kind of increases their employment opportunities that aren't there today. So trying to keep our eye on all those things. It's a lot of different moving parts. But again, I think we're doing a better job than we did in the past. I think there's still room for improvement. No other questions at the moment?
It doesn't look like it in the chat.
All right. Well, I want to thank you kind of for this opportunity to kind of talk to you. It's great to see people with interest in this area. I think it's a fascinating time for students who have interest in kind of climate change and energy in general. I think we're going to continue to see a lot of changes over the next 20, 30 years. So, again, keep studying, the science and tech areas I think are going to be really interesting in this area as batteries research kind of goes further and further on how efficient we can make a battery. I think there's a lot of kind of interesting areas to explore. So it's great to see all this interest from students in this area.
So with that, if anybody else doesn't have any other questions, we have about 7 minutes left in here, but you guys can go to lunch early. Just remember to come back for the third session of the day. The third session starts at 1 o'clock. So yeah, just remember.
There is one more question I saw.
Oh.
Do you see that in chat? Do you want to read it?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So it says, how do you handle knowing what needs to be done to help mitigate climate change, but not being able to do to the public's opinions on how things should be done?
That's a really good question. Anybody who's been kind of watching politics, recently, it always seems like, there's a bunch of people on one side and a bunch of people on the other side. I got involved in this area because I was interested in solving problems. So to me, I don't really care which party somebody is. If they come to the table looking to solve problems, then we're engaging with them. But I think that's what we're maybe haven't seen quite as much of recently, is really kind of this focus on, are we solving problems? To me, in every political debate, that should be the very first question. What problem did you identify and what did you do to solve the problem? What steps did you actually do to solve it? Not just kind of talk about it. So, I feel very fortunate that I have a job where I do get to try to solve problems and try to make things better. Do I wish things, would move faster? Yeah, I do. But, I figure I get to spend my days, trying to move that needle and trying to move it forward. Again, I think more people want to see that kind of people coming together. I caught the end of the last session with Denise Keel, where, she was talking about, does it take a third party or whatever? To me, there's lots of different ways to get at it, but it seems like it does take a lot of people really pushing toward that idea that, hey, I don't need to get everything that I want, but I need to see progress. So a little bit of, compromise is good if that's me moving the needle forward. As long as we're kind of making progress every single year and things keep getting better every single year, that's the good sign. You just don't want to, make progress for 3 years, then slip back. You don't want to kind of be herky jerky about it. We'd like to see kind of steady progress moving forward. But again, it's, I think the good news when it comes to climate change, and I think it's important to kind of look at this, is that yes, we do have to reduce our energy footprint, significantly. The good news is that most of the technology to get there is already out there. It's just a matter of implementing it. Better insulating homes, more efficient engines, more efficient motors for doing things, a cleaner electrical grid. So the technology to solve a lot of these problems is out there. Then it becomes just the will to do it, making sure the resources are being allocated in the right place to do it. There is still research and development to be done. We're going to need to get better at things, but we can do that kind of simultaneously as we're already implementing what we know today. I think we understand much better today kind of the impacts of climate change and how it's going to have significant impacts both on people's lives and on the economy. So doing everything we can to kind of minimize those impacts, getting ready for it, so you're kind of mitigating, getting ready for it, getting more resilient, at the same time trying to minimize the extent possible those impacts will happen in the future.
Okay, I think that's all the questions now. So thank you so much for spending your Saturday here presenting this to us. It's been very good. Thank you. Everybody else, lunch starts now, I guess. Just remember to come back at 1 o'clock for sessions 3 and 4, and then our keynote at the end of the day. So thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.